In the spring of 1902, Martinique's Mount Pelée began behaving in ways that made locals uneasy, but not yet desperate. Ash drifted down like a nuisance that dirtied roofs and crops. The mountain rumbled, and a faint sulfur smell threaded through the air. People complained, adapted, and kept living, because the island had seen storms, quakes, and scares before. Saint-Pierre, the island's proud port city, treated the unrest like background noise. It had theatres, cafes, and shipping money. Paris of the West Indies, in the language of boosterism. The volcano sat above it like a permanent landmark, familiar enough to be ignored. Familiarity is a powerful anesthetic, especially when daily life depends on not panicking. Warnings arrived in fragments, and fragments rarely move governments. Ashfall reached the town early in May. The sky sometimes dimmed in the afternoon. Residents argued over whether it meant danger or just inconvenience. Some people left, many didn't. When crowds gather, they don't always gather to flee. Sometimes they gather to watch. Politics tightened the trap. Elections and civic pride made evacuation feel like surrender to rumor. Commercial leaders feared losing labor, customers, and shipping schedules. Officials feared being blamed for overreacting. Each day without catastrophe made the next warning easier to dismiss, because nothing is more persuasive than yesterday's survival. Then the mountain produced a sign that should have ended debate. On May 5th, a mudflow swept down a river valley, destroying a sugar works and killing people who had no warning that the mountain could send a liquid wall instead of ash. The disaster was local, but its meaning was broad. Pelée had shifted from noise to violence. The mudflow also taught the wrong lesson to many observers. People saw it as an isolated accident, a freak event tied to rain and runoff, not a marker of escalation. It didn't look like the popular image of volcanic doom. No lava rivers, no glowing summit. So it was easier to categorize and move past. As the week progressed, the mountain's behavior changed. Explosions became more forceful. Ash thickened. The atmosphere felt loaded, as if the air had weight. The city's relationship with the volcano became a strange mixture of dread and routine. Everyone talked about it, but most still slept in their own beds. This was the moment when a modern instinct would have demanded specialists on scene. In 1902, however, specialists traveled slowly, and their authority competed with local officials who had to make decisions under public pressure. Scientific expertise existed, but the machinery for rapid response barely did. Even so, the coming catastrophe pulled attention across the Atlantic. Newspapers intensified the drama. Authorities exchanged messages. Ships were watched and readied. The island's capital at Fort-de-France, farther from the volcano, became the node where uncertainty turned into frantic planning. On the morning of May 8th, the mountain ended the argument in minutes. A ground-hugging blast, hot gas and ash moving faster than human comprehension, hit Saint-Pierre and erased the city's living core almost instantly. The destruction wasn't just fire. It was a physical suffocation of heat, debris, and toxic air that left little time even to understand what was happening. The shock created a new kind of mission. Not evacuation, not debate, but approach. Ships offshore saw a city burning and a coastline transformed. Crews had to decide whether to land, whether the air was breathable, whether the sea itself was safe from floating debris and sudden surges. Rescue parties entered a landscape that looked familiar in outline, but wrong in detail. Buildings were broken open like shells. Streets were filled with ash and rubble. Silence replaced commerce. Survivors were almost non-existent, and those found were in forms that didn't match heroic rescue stories. Burned, choking, delirious, hidden in improbable pockets of shelter. The most famous discovery was not a triumphant saving of crowds, but a single imprisoned man found alive in a stone cell. days later. His survival became a global headline because it was easier to process than the scale of the dead. One life you can picture. A city's worth of lives becomes a number. But the mountain did not stop after May 8th. Its continued activity made every approach a gamble. Rescuers faced not only heat and ash, but the possibility that the volcano could produce another lethal blast without warning. Each trip inland became a calculation. How long can you stay before the mountain chooses you? That is where the Mount Pelée expedition story truly begins. The disaster created two overlapping expeditions, one practical, one scientific. Practical teams went in to recover the living, account for the dead, and stabilize what could still be stabilized. Scientific observers arrived to document what had happened, and by doing so, to make the next such disaster less invisible. By late May, the island was no longer living through a single event, but a continuing crisis. More eruptions would come, and one would kill again, including people who had come to help. Pelée had turned Martinique into a place where even rescue and investigation were forms of exposure, and exposure could be fatal. After the destruction of Saint-Pierre, the first expeditions moved like sailors, boarding a wreck that might still be on fire. The coastline was cluttered with ruined ships and debris. Heat shimmered above ash-covered streets. The air carried a bitter odor that signaled both burning and something chemical. Men landed anyway, because the alternative was to leave the city to silence. The immediate task was brutally narrow: find the living. That search ended quickly, not from lack of effort, but from lack of results. Most bodies were unrecoverable in any conventional sense. Many victims had been killed where they stood. Others were trapped in collapsed stone. The environment itself resisted the work, hot, unstable, and coated in material that clung to skin and lungs. The expedition's second task was to define safe distance, and that was harder than it sounds. The eruption that destroyed the city had demonstrated that danger did not behave like a slow flood. It behaved like a fast wall. That meant outside the city was not automatically safe, and inside the city was not uniformly lethal. Safety became patchwork. Survivors existed mostly on margins, people sheltered by terrain, luck, or unusual architecture. When rescuers pulled someone alive from rubble days later, it felt like proof that more might be hidden. The hope extended the searches, even when evidence suggested there were few, and the mountain's ongoing unrest made every extra hour costly. As news spread, more outsiders arrived: engineers, administrators, journalists, doctors, and scientists. Each carried their own mission, and those missions competed for time and access. Rescue demanded speed. Documentation demanded careful observation. Authorities wanted control of the story to prevent panic and protect commerce elsewhere on the island. Scientific expeditions treated the ruins as data. They mapped damage patterns. They compared the city's windswept edges to its annihilated center. They examined how ships in the harbor were scorched and sunk. The goal was not morbid curiosity. It was explanation. A disaster that cannot be explained becomes a template for future disbelief. The problem was that Pelée kept producing danger while being studied. Ash continued to fall. Explosions continued. The summit's behavior suggested ongoing magma movement. People on the ground had to interpret the mountain's rhythm without the benefit of modern monitoring. Each new sound could mean nothing or mean everything. By May 20th, the island learned that after was an illusion. Another powerful eruption killed again, including people who had come in the wake of the first catastrophe. The second blow was psychologically different. The first destroyed a city in a moment. The second killed those who believed the moment had passed, turning response itself into risk. This forced a shift in expedition behavior. Approaches became shorter and more tactical. Teams chose vantage points and withdrawal routes. They relied on local knowledge and constant sky-watching. The work began to resemble military reconnaissance, not because there was an enemy with intent, but because the terrain behaved like an ambush. In the midst of this, the language of volcanology changed. Observers began using and popularizing terms for the deadly clouds, nube ardente, because the phenomenon demanded its own category. It wasn't lava, it wasn't a conventional ashfall. It was a hot current, capable of moving fast, hugging ground, and killing through heat and inhalation before flames were even visible. The expedition story also became an ethics story. How close should scientists go? How long should crews remain near devastated zones? At what point does documentation become self-endangerment without added benefit? These questions weren't academic. They were asked while the mountain rumbled and the air tasted like ash. Meanwhile, displaced people needed food, shelter, and medical care. Relief expeditions had to operate under fear of further eruptions. Camps and supply depots could not simply be placed wherever convenient. They had to be placed where the mountain's reach seemed limited, and seemed was the best anyone could do. As weeks turned into months, Pelée's behavior shifted again. It entered phases of dome growth and repeated explosive events, culminating later in deadly flows that struck other settlements. The crisis was no longer one city's ruin, but an extended campaign of hazard that reshaped the northern half of the island. By this stage, the expeditions had split into specialized streams. Relief operations focused on survival, moving people, preventing disease outbreaks, restoring order. Scientific missions focused on mechanism, how the blast traveled, why it accelerated, what physical signatures it left. Each needed the other, but their priorities rarely aligned neatly. The mountain's ongoing activity imposed a final constraint. No one could write a clean ending while the volcano still had energy to spend. Every report, every map, every survivor interview carried an asterisk. This may not be the last time. On Martinique, in 1902, investigation and waiting became intertwined because the volcano itself was still writing chapters. When the ash settled enough for sustained study, the most important discovery was not a single dramatic clue, but a pattern. Damage radiated in a way that implied a directed force rather than uniform fallout. Some structures were shattered outward, others were simply stripped and scorched. In places, objects looked untouched by flame, yet surrounded by death, suggesting heat and gas did the killing before fire could. This pushed scientists toward a clearer explanation. The May 8th catastrophe was driven by a fast, ground-hugging current of hot gas and ash, not a slow rain of debris. That distinction mattered because it rewrote the public's idea of what volcanoes do. A city can outrun lava in some cases. It cannot outrun a blast that arrives in minutes. Investigators reconstructed the timeline through indirect signals. Telegraph messages ceased abruptly. Ships offshore reported sudden darkness and heat. Survivors on the outskirts described a wind-like impact. These accounts weren't perfect, but together they created a sequence that could be studied, argued, and taught. The most unsettling lesson was speed. The lethal surge reached Saint-Pierre within minutes of the major break in the mountain. That made traditional human responses, gather belongings, load carts, move families, irrelevant. Disaster planning based on gradual escalation would fail in the face of a phenomenon that compresses the decision window to seconds. The expeditions also exposed how human systems amplify natural hazard. Saint-Pierre had become a magnet for those fleeing ash from nearby areas, concentrating people in the very place most exposed. Political reluctance to evacuate did not cause the eruption, but it shaped how many bodies were in its path when it happened. The scientific aftermath produced lasting vocabulary. The term nube ardente became a way to name and therefore remember the mechanism. Naming matters because unnamed danger is easily reinterpreted as myth, and myths invite repeat errors. The Mount Pelée investigations became foundational for understanding pyroclastic currents as a primary kill mechanism, not an exotic exception. Relief operations confronted a different permanence. The island's social geography had shifted. Saint-Pierre did not simply rebuild as if nothing happened. Commerce rerouted, people relocated. Fort-de-France's role grew. The disaster didn't only kill, it redistributed power, labor, and identity across Martinique. The expedition's story also includes an uncomfortable cultural afterlife. Singular survivors, especially the prisoner found alive, became symbols that traveled farther than the dead. They were displayed, interviewed, sometimes exploited. Public attention prefers a face to a statistic, and that preference can distort memory, making a catastrophe feel like a story of exceptions instead of a story of absence. As Pelée continued erupting into later years, the island's relationship with the volcano became a long negotiation. People learned where to live and where not to. Authorities learned that uncertainty itself is a hazard. Scientists learned that the most dangerous events can look like smoke until they are already moving. The expedition findings traveled globally. Other volcanic regions began rethinking what safe distance means. Harbor cities near volcanoes began considering that ships are not automatically refugees. Emergency planning began shifting, slowly, from assumptions of gradual change to the possibility of rapid, directed, lethal currents. Yet the core tragedy remained resistant to any technical framing. Knowing what a pyroclastic surge is does not undo the fact that thousands died in a few minutes. The expedition reports can explain mechanism, but mechanism is a cold comfort when the human window to act was nearly non-existent. The political lesson was blunt. Evacuation decisions cannot be made only by consensus or commerce when the hazard can outrun debate. The mountain demonstrated that waiting for certainty is sometimes choosing casualties. In 1902, certainty arrived as a wall of heat, and by then, the decision was no longer in human hands. Mount Pelée also left a warning about normal days. The weeks before May 8th contained signs that, in hindsight, look obvious. In the moment, they looked like manageable disruptions. Expeditions after the disaster had to fight not only geological ignorance, but psychological denial, the tendency to treat escalating risk as routine, because routine is what makes life possible. By the time the investigations matured, the catastrophe had already shifted from crisis to reference point. Pelée became a case study in volcanic lethality, urban vulnerability, and the cost of delayed action. The expedition's success was real, understanding improved, but its victory was limited by timing. Science arrived in force after the city was gone. The final legacy is that Mount Pelée turned volcanology into something closer to forensic work. It demanded reconstruction of invisible forces from physical traces and survivor fragments. It also demonstrated that the most dangerous hazards are not always the ones people expect to see. The 1902 Pelée expedition was, in essence, a race to interpret a disaster that moved faster than interpretation, and to make sure the next city didn't rely on familiarity as a shield.